Welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. I'm Alice McCrum, Programs Manager. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to be in conversation with Paula Deitz, author, journalist, and longtime editor at the Hudson Review. Before we get started, 3 quick reminders. If you haven't done so already, please do turn on your camera. It makes a huge difference, and so therefore your video. It makes a huge difference not only for fellow guests who like to look out and see a sea of smiling faces, but also for Paula, who likewise would like to see all of you. Secondly, if you have any comments about tonight's conversation or questions for Paula, I encourage you to post them in the chat box to the bottom right of your screen at any moment. I will be moderating the chat at about 40 minutes into the event. And so please go ahead and post your questions and comments. Finally, if you have a spare 10 minutes at the end of tonight's program, we will be also hosting a virtual reception, which is essentially a breakout room. But we encourage you to stay on the call, and it will last for about 10 to 15 minutes. So now I will introduce Miss Paula Dietz, and then we'll go ahead and have our conversation. Paula Dietz is the editor of the Hudson Review and has been the editor since 1998. She's also a cultural critic whose articles about art, architecture, and landscape design appear in newspapers and magazines in the US and abroad. A graduate of Smith College, she received her MA in French literature from Columbia University. Her book of Gardens Selected Essays is now an audiobook, and in addition, she has edited 2 anthologies, Rites of Passage, coming-of-age stories and memoirs from the Hudson Review, and Poets Translate Poets, a Hudson Review anthology. Dietz's forthcoming book, Thibaut's Heart, A Journey Through France and Time, follows Thibaut IV, Count of Champagne, who was a famous chansonnier. Did I say that right, Paula?
Perfect, perfect, thank you.
Paula, it's such a pleasure to have you with us at the library. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted, and it's wonderful to feel like I'm in Paris. I'm kind of imagining it the whole time.
Albeit virtually, and you have spoken at the library before. We have to...
Yes, so I'm sort of imagining myself in that wonderful room. Thank you for asking me.
For anyone who hasn't been to an event before, I've been programs manager now for about 3 months, and one of the first things I did was look through kind of old programs and was so thrilled to see that Paula, my old friend from New York, had spoken at the library before, and so it was completely lovely, and we had to invite her back. So Paula, you've been the longtime editor at the Hudson Review since 1998. And so the first question, for those who might not have heard of the review or have just come to know of it because of our programs, can you describe to the audience, what is the Hudson Review and how did it start?
Right, well, it's a wonderful, first I'm delighted, to have a wonderful guy. I love talking with Alice McCrum, so this is a great pleasure for me today, So this goes back to Princeton University. My late husband, Frederick Morgan, who was one of the founders of the review, was actually drafted to go to Princeton because he was writing poetry in prep school at St. Paul's. Because Princeton, that very year that they were coming into the university, had hired a Southern poet, very well known at that time, Alan Tate, to teach creative writing, which was, very controversial at Princeton among all the academics. But they wanted to make a good show, so they went to all the schools to try to find young men who were actually writing poetry. And so they were in the class. Actually, Fred always told great stories about Alan coming in a little bit hungover with a kind of wet towel on his head and talked to the boys, as he would call them. But in that class, he met another student named Joseph Bennett, and they decided while they were there that they would become editors of the Nassau Lit, which was the literary magazine of Princeton. And they were kind of outrageous. They did a wonderful job, but they used to bring in showgirls from New York to get subscriptions, and they became very famous on campus. But of course, this was wartime, and this class was graduated in January of 1943, rather than waiting, till springtime, because they were all drafted into the armed services. I mean, the trains were actually waiting on the tracks in Princeton to take them to their various camps. But Alan Tate came to the boys that day they were graduating and said, you know, you boys, if you survive the war and get back to New York, you should start your own literary review. And that's exactly what happened. They came back to New York and they got to work on it right away. And the first issue came out in spring 1948. And within the first year, they had Thomas Mann. They had actually had Thomas Mann in the Nassau Lit because he was living in Princeton at that time. And they had Alan Tate and W.S. Merwin, who was a student at Princeton and who became a very famous poet. So right away, they got a reputation. And actually, Time magazine, writing about little magazines, predicted that the Hudson Review was the one that was going to survive. And when we had our 60th anniversary, I reminded Time magazine, and they did another piece that they did survive. And so it very quickly caught on and grew as time went on, and to include all of the visual and the performing arts, and of course, book reviews. And essentially, each issue has a letter from abroad or a comment, some short comment about literature. We do literary essays, short stories, poetry, and we cover all of the arts. So it's only 176 pages, but it's crammed with everything you know about the contemporary art scene, essentially. And so I came on kind of in the 60s, if we want to go on about that.
Well, we're going to get to that. I guess, Paula, what do you think distinguished the review from other kind of literary magazines?
Well, I think we still are one of the very few magazines that read unsolicited work. In other words, we're not soliciting from famous writers. If anyone who's been in the Hudson Review appears famous to you now, it's usually because we heard from them out of the blue. And so we still have assigned reading periods to read short stories, essays, and poems every year. And this keeps the magazine young. I mean, we're now approaching our 75th anniversary, but we've just, are still publishing very new writers. So we've kept young all these years. And as a matter of fact, one of the main essays in the current issue just came in a few weeks ago. And it's really about the discovery of vaccinations for smallpox in Turkey way back in the 18th century. But it's a marvelous article, really, that then is a lesson to today about how one should feel about illnesses and cures. It's great. And it's going to be one of the lead essays, and we didn't have it. I mean, there it is now in the magazine. So I think that the fact that we're always looking for new writers, we're not looking for fame, is really what's made it so fun. And really, it's an adventure every day because you don't know what's going to come in the mail or now online, right?
Right. And we're going to get to this too. I did just want to go back to the beginning, with Fred in the 50s and just read out some of the people who they were publishing, because it is really astonishing. Well, maybe you can speak to it.
Well, we had Robert Lowell, Anthony Hecht, James Merrill, A.R. Ammons, and Sylvia.
Sorry,
yes.
was he friends with these people? I mean, how did he meet them? How did he get them to?
Well, by writing to them. At that point, you did write to them, and then I think the Hudson Review just became known very quickly, and people sent in work. And then he would contact people just to let them know that we're there. They were not shy, either Joe Bennett or Frederick Morgan. So they became really part of a literary circle in New York in that way. So they became very well known very quickly. I think that's how it all happened.
Paula, I want to read a quote. This is you quoting your late husband about the function of a literary review, although we're talking obviously about the Hudson Review. I'll read the quote and then I'll ask you a question. So this was, I think, during a speech that you gave a few years back. You said, again, according to Fred, a literary review performing its function conscientiously should contribute to the deeper changes taking place in society and culture and help us to understand and evaluate them.
This was a quote from Fred.
Yeah, this is a quote from Fred. I'll say it once more.
Yes, he always felt that we were showing contemporary American civilization. This is one of his original goals, I think, by expressing through the literature, through the arts and everything, that we were really showing the great high standard of contemporary American life. And I think that was his major goal in the beginning.
Yeah, and then to this point of contributing to the deeper changes of the society.
Right.
So it's had a long life, the Hudson Review. What happened?
Yes, and we've done, for example, we've done 2 environmental issues, which have been very interesting, bringing up new works and new ideas about. I mean, essentially, when we're not publishing anything that isn't expressing something new. Otherwise, we wouldn't be publishing it. I mean, we're very careful about that, and I have a wonderful group of advisory editors, for example, who will guide me on that. If something comes in a field that I'm not a specialist in, I will want to know what my advisory editor in that field will tell me, for that reason, that we want to be the ones who are expressing the new ideas in the culture.
So apart from the environment, what other kind of new ideas?
Well, in the early days, there was a whole school of literature called New Criticism that became very popular. I don't think we're representing that too much now, because I think that was something that had its own period. And what's so interesting about that is when I went to Smith, that's how you learn literature. You didn't learn it through biography or in the environment. You learned it only by scanning the piece and interpreting the piece itself. And they became one of the standards in those early days of New Criticism. But then as other academic things took over, more scientific language and so forth, we withdrew from that kind of academic learning. And now we're much more interested in personal reactions to literature. And actually my managing editor, Ron Corey, has just done a whole anthology of personal essays of this kind that we now champion, of people expressing their own beliefs in particularly on specific books that they've read, which brings another new idea, right?
Yeah. I think we should get back to that. I want to return to that later, but I want to kind of bring you into the story here, because so the Hudson Review is happily expanding and flourishing even. And how did you become kind of involved, let's say, with the review and one of the founders?
Right. Well, frankly, it all goes back to Smith College. When I was a senior at Smith, I had to write a seminar paper, a presentation at a seminar in Japan on the hero in Japanese fiction. And in those days, of course, we didn't have Google. You had the Periodic Guide Index, a great big red covered volume where you read which magazines were reviewing what books. And I looked up Mishima and Kawabata and so forth. And the only magazine that was reviewing their novels was the Hudson Review. And I can still see myself sitting on the floor in the stacks of the library, reading the Hudson Review reviews. And I believe in that issue right away, there was a poem by Frederick Morgan, the editor. And I just loved the magazine. And, when you're a student, and I went to graduate school, you don't get subscriptions, you just buy it. I would buy it whenever I was in a bookstore or, on the street someplace, I'd see it. And after I finished my graduate work, I got my first job was at the Bollingen Foundation in New York, which was really supported by Paul Mellon. It was essentially a nonprofit publishing company. And they were publishing the collected works of Paul Valery, and they needed somebody to be the assistant editor. And I got this wonderful job, just totally tailor-made for me. And I realized after the first few weeks that the editor, and who was also vice president of the foundation, was a friend of Fred Morgan. So one day when Fred Morgan telephoned, I happened to answer it in our office, and I just said how much I liked the review. And that began 4 years of telephone calls. And
but they were
professional, very professional.
They were professional telephone calls.
Yeah, very professional telephone calls. Sometimes we advertised in the Hudson Review our books, and Or if I knew, or my editor Jackson Matthews, if the writer we wanted to recommend, Fred Morgan would say, please don't send me the whole thing, just make a selection, and he would publish it. And so it was just professional things back and forth. We only met once at a party after a poetry reading, and the only difference for the next 2 years was it was no longer Miss Dietz and Mr. Morgan, it was Paula and Fred, but very formal. And eventually he called me.
Vouvoying. I mean, in France, you would have been using the vous form.
We would still be using the vouvoyer, even with the first names. Let me tell you, he was much older than I was. As far as I was concerned, he was a grown-up, and I was still, a graduate student type. Anyway, so he said, you've done so many favors for me all these years, I'll take you to lunch. And at the lunch, he said that he was curious to know if I would come and work at the Hudson Review. Joseph Bennett, his longtime co-editor, had at that point decided, after making a pile on Wall Street, that he wanted to live abroad. And so in a sense, Fred was missing that person that he could discuss manuscripts with and had a kind of similar approach to literature. But I was on my way to Paris to do research on Paul Valéry. So I said that no, that, I was very complimented, but I said, I'm on my way to Paris. And, having spent my junior year abroad in Geneva, I mean, there's nothing more exciting to go to Paris. And so I spent my time in Paris, living in Paris. And then when I came back, the publishing company, the Bonnigan Foundation, decided that all the books would hitherto be published by the Princeton University Press. And I'm from that area, and I had no desire to move back home. So I let Frederick Morgan know that I would be interested. And I gather at that point that it was barely open because he was interviewing other people. So I got it just in time. And to tell you the rest of the story, I'm just going to quote Jane Eyre and said, reader, I married him. And that's it. And so we edited the magazine our entire married life together. And when we got to ex-co-editors, and when we got to 1998, Fred said after 50 years, that was long enough for anyone to do any one thing. And he desperately wanted to write his poems, because one of the great things that happened after we got married is he began writing poetry again. And he did 8 books of poetry, and I'm about to bring out his 9th. I'm his executor. And after he died, I found 23 poems, finished poems that had not been published yet in any of his collections. So next year, for his centennial, actually, I'm coming out with a book called Epilogue, Selected and Last Poems. So at that point, he said to me, you have a choice, because the other great miracle that happened during our marriage is that I began writing. And he said, if we end the magazine, it can just be, a historic 20th century magazine, and you could just be a writer and enjoy just writing every day. But I could not bear to give up this office and the excitement of working with contemporary writers. I mean, now when I think of all the writers we've done since 1998, I can't imagine my life without them. He gave me 6 months to make the decision, and I made the decision. But I would not let him off the hook. So until his very last days, we were reading. I wouldn't let him off the hook on reading manuscripts. And so until his last days, he read manuscripts and gave me his opinions, just like any of my advisory editors. So we continued on, and we're very excited. Just, as I say, every day is an adventure.
So what year did you join the review?
In 1967.
1967. All
right. And we all celebrate our anniversaries. As a matter of fact, my managing editor, Ron Corey, last week just celebrated his 40th anniversary of things. So we do have longevity at Hudson Review. And we had a lovely dinner. And I see some of my guests there with us today. And I remember we celebrated my 50th anniversary, but I didn't feel like Fred. I just wanted to continue.
Yeah, I haven't actually asked you this, Paula, but it occurred to me. So you first met him by way of his poetry?
Yes, I did read him because he did not write a lot in those days, and this was actually one of the complaints of his life, is that he hadn't had kind of the peace and the concentration to publish a book. And actually, he published his first book after we were married.
Okay.
He published his first book at the age of 50.
Okay. So what was it? I suppose my question is, what was it like to meet his poetry first and then to meet the man?
Well, I was delighted. I just loved his work. And so, I mean, I thought it was absolutely, when he took me to lunch, I thought it was absolutely thrilling to meet this writer whom I admired. I mean, it was, I was even shy of going to cocktail parties, publishing parties and things like that. So it was a big deal just getting myself ready to go to a lunch with him.
I suppose what I meant is, could you see his character in the poetry?
And not everything, because every poem is so different, and the poems are not written sort of always in the first person. And there weren't that many. There were just a few in the Hudson Review over the years. So and I can see now, when he really began writing poems, which he showed me every one as he wrote them, then I began really to learn about him. And that was one of the great things of the marriage.
Okay, let's talk about the marriage, and let's talk about your working relationship, because I imagine some people on the call might think, working full-time with my spouse, that sounds horrific.
Well, I think quite the opposite. I don't know how people are married when they go off in the morning to different lives, because it was our whole life. We did other things. We loved ballet, and we loved the opera, and we loved taking walks in Central Park and talking about our own work. But as I say, it goes back to that adventure, things coming in that you must talk about as to whether you're going to accept a manuscript or not. And no one understands either. Running a magazine, and we have a small staff, you're also running a business. It's not just all literature. It's taxes, it's fundraising, it's everything. And you have to have all those qualities, to be an editor, especially when you don't have a very large staff. Many magazines might have a dozen people, but we only have 3 working for us. And so you have a lot of things to attend to. And we both had that talent that we could do that in addition to discussing literature. If we had a difference of opinion, we each had specialties that, Fred was a great classicist. He read the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek. He was way beyond me in many things. So, but there are many things in contemporary life that I had a better grasp of. And so we would understand what our strengths and weaknesses were. And it was not hard to give in. And if we had a difference of opinion on something, that we would kind of discuss it. And sometimes we let it go for a few days and then come back to it. And often what happens even in the office today is office on rereading something after you're discussing it, you see it in a new way. And this happens to all of us in the office all the time, I've noticed, even now.
No, it's wonderful. We had talked on the phone about kind of how your different dispositions complemented each other.
Well, yes, I was telling you about a wonderful cartoon. There's a great cartoon by Whitney Darrow, who's one of the great cartoonists of the New Yorker. And I actually have it hanging in my kitchen. And it shows, he always wrote about these kind of suburban people in Connecticut, which is one of our states that's sort of suburban to New York. And it's showing a party in the background, and there's in another room, there's a man reading a book, and his wife comes running over, kind of jitterbugging, getting him to, come and dance. And he looks up to her and actually says, Paula, is Paula in the cartoon, Paula, you knew when you married me, I was interdirected. And in this sense, that was our life. I was the jitterbugger, and he was the reader. But we brought each other into our 2 worlds, and it just worked beautifully that way. But we each maintained somewhat that aspect in our marriage, I believe.
Do you think your way of reading and editing evolved over the years? I imagine it did, but in what way did it evolve? And do you think you ended up kind of more closely aligned by the end in terms of what you were looking for in manuscripts, or did you grow apart in that way?
No, I look very much at the way we did our editorial work as a steady road. Of course, it changes by what the manuscripts are, but I don't think that we ever grew closer or further apart from that. I think there was something just very enjoyable about sitting down together and just having a talk. Any couple would have this, when you really sit down and talk about something that's really important, and you begin to think about how each other thinks. It's really just an honor and a pleasure, in a way, to do that. And I believe that I really don't see a great change in it. I would say maybe it deepened our respect for each other. I think if it could have, it began so well. But I think in any way, I think along with the love that deepens, I think our understanding of each other deepened as well. And also through our writing, because I was understanding more about him through his poetry. And even though I was doing really journalism, he learned many more aspects about me as well.
So what do you look for in a manuscript then and now?
Well, we just use the word excellent. I mean, I've often used this from having my time teaching at Columbia when I was a graduate student. When you're reading term papers, you always know the A paper, and then everything else falls away. I mean, then you see how everybody else is graded. And so, for example, I am the sole first reader on nonfiction. And I read from January 1 to March 31st. And this year, it's very touching because by January 3rd, I have a pile of essays. So people are waiting all year to send things to us. And we don't, although we take fiction online, we don't allow the nonfiction. I want to get it in a hard copy. So I've just read 50 essays, and out of them, I so far have only taken 2. And they are both the A papers. And there are about 6 that are in specialties that I'm now eliciting the opinions of my advisory editors. So maybe there'll be one more. But
how quickly?
So you're looking for, you know, we're very open to any genre. I mean, it can be something very way out. It can be something slightly conservative. What we're looking for is excellence. It has to be excellent, and then we'll publish it. So we're very varied. I mean, we don't have a sort of political point of view or whatever. It just has to make the grade. Yes.
I imagine that you've gotten faster and faster over time to know whether or not this is an excellent piece of work.
Yes. I mean, well, you just know because you read so much. I mean, that's all we do. Mm. And if somebody's a subscriber, of course, they can send things to us anytime. So, I mean, essays do come in all year because then people subscribe just so they can send an essay, you know. And, you know, you read them all. I mean, you admire the work that goes into it. I mean, that there's no question about. I mean, people work hard to do it. I mean, there's sometimes, I must say, people who have not looked at the Hudson Review and will send us something that's kind of outrageous. But that's few and far between. Most of the time, people are genuinely trying to get into the magazine.
Okay, so now we're gonna move a little bit onto you as a person, as a writer, as visionary, as an inspiration, as a friend.
Too much.
As Paula Deitz. So I guess our kind of transitional question, Paula, is I've rarely met, and we have met, not dear reader, but dear audience, we have met in person. We met, Paula and I, at a dinner party many years ago now. 5 years, 6 years.
It was a Christmas dinner party given by Nancy Hoppin, and on your side, you can tell me who else it was, the host. But they mixed us all up. We were all ages, and they mixed us all up. It was great fun. And
so Paula and I sat next to each other, and we kind of had this, well, it was like love, you know, love at first, friendship at first sight.
Yes, and we haven't stopped talking since. So that's another conversation, everybody.
And so I've already asked you this kind of personally, but I want to ask you this publicly because I think you're full of so much wisdom. What is your kind of secret to you know, your energy, your spirit, your openness, you know. So just to give you a sense of Paula's openness, yesterday we had a practice Zoom call, and we essentially spent 20 minutes redirecting how to Zoom, let's say. So where should you put your camera? Where should you put your, where should you put the computer? And most authors are fairly, well, they're opposed to any kind of change. And Paula immediately was saying, well, what book can I get? How can I help you do this? How can I do this? Okay, so.
Well, tell them our computers are stationed on big piles of books.
So big piles of books, that's the secret. If you don't know how to do a good Zoom call.
Take a hint from us.
Take a page from us. Take a page from us. No, but what is your kind of your secret to life and secret to writing and secret to eternal youth and energy?
Well, you know, I mean, well, let me come back to the writing. I'll talk about the regime, as it were, and then I'll come back to the writing and how that happened. But I'm a swimmer, so I'm just about to start again after the pandemic, but I swim 3 times a week, and I work out in a gym 2 to 3 times a week in the early mornings, and I walk, and I eat yogurt for lunch, and you know, I do all these sort of healthy things, but mainly it's, you know, you just have to have a joie de vivre. You just have to just love every minute of it, and every day just feels very precious to me, and I try not to ruin it. And once in a while, we ruin a day. Actually, Fred always had a wonderful phrase for me, which I bring up at the office all the time. Sometimes I will put off something. And Fred said it was sort of magical. He said, you have something called profitable procrastination. Whenever you've decided something's not quite ready to do, eventually a reason comes up, and you just do it at the right time. So I don't worry about those things too much. But I think I'm just, you know, I'm just very active. I think I've been that way, you know, ever since, except I think in my 20s, when we all used to go out for hamburgers for lunch. That was a bad time because they just made you sleepy in the afternoon, but I stopped all that and, you know, picked up in my 30s, and then that was all right. The writing, I actually had I don't know how many people have unfortunate experience in school, but I was obviously a top grade student. When I was in the 8th grade, I wrote an essay. We had to write an essay about the school. And I wrote about the cornerstone. And I didn't know that you shouldn't anthropomorphize something. And the teacher actually held up the essay and ridiculed it in class, which was the most humiliating moment of my entire education. And I thought, oh, I just can't write. I can do math, I can do physics, and I was doing electronics, and I was doing all these things. And I thought I just couldn't write. And so I never went out for the newspaper. It was just a horrible experience. And then after I married, and my husband and I had a house in Maine, and we were driving up, and he said to me, you know, every time we go to an art show, or we just came back from Europe, and every time you see something new, you have a take on it, and you put in elements that nobody would ever think of. He said, did you ever think of taking one of those episodes and writing about it? And he said, you have all summer now, so why don't you sit down and write something? And that was my first article. And it was actually about a garden. It was about the garden in the House of the Seven Gables, which was very beautifully done because for those of you who have read Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, there was a photographer living in the attic who found old seeds of scarlet runner beans. And those of you who are gardeners, you know that it's runner beans that have beautiful red flowers. And in the story, they're on a little hop house, and they attract hummingbirds because, as you all know, hummingbirds are attracted by red above any other color. And so I always read 19th century novels in the summer when I'm in Maine. And I had a group of sort of synchronicity kind of coincidences the summer I read it. I had a letter from a friend in Britain who had just planted them and commented about the hummingbirds. And then that same summer, my husband and I went to visit a great organic gardener named Scott Nearing. And when you visited Scott Nearing, you didn't visit him, you worked in the fields. And we were waiting to find out what field he was in. And his wife said, while you're waiting, why don't you go down to the garden where the scarlet runner beans are, because you'll see the hummingbirds. And it was so marvelous that I wrote a piece about it. And I sent it to a few magazines. It was turned down. And then finally a magazine accepted it and I got $500. And I've been on deadline ever since. Because once you are in a magazine, other editors see you and to do it. But the interesting thing is that I had got more mail for that article than I have for anything I've written since. And I still have a box full of letters like, where do you buy scarlet runner beans? And just tell people now, if they're interested, just go to your local garden shop and they have them, especially in London.
Especially in London, where I'm not.
Right. Right.
What drew you to gardens, writing about gardens and nature? And
well, I really began by writing about architecture, and I'm not trained in that field, but I was a great admirer of Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the first architecture critic of the New York Times, and I read every word she wrote. In a sense, I went to her architecture school. I learned from her how to make an opinion. And one of the first journals I began writing for New York was called the New York Arts Journal, and I'd done some arts pieces for them. And I asked if I could review, and I remember the day I went down. In 1978, the National Gallery in Washington opened their new wing called the East Wing by I.M. Pei. And I asked if I could review that, and I made my appointment with I.M. Pei, and I went down to Washington for I got an early press view because I was getting it with him. And I remember the day I walked in, the whole building is based on the concept of an isosceles triangle. It's a magnificent contemporary building. And actually, when I went in, I remember the British sculptor Anthony Caro was actually soldering his piece together right on the shelf above a doorway. I mean, it was very, very exciting. And I wrote that first piece and then kind of took off from there. And I had gone to, during that period, I went to a lecture at Rockefeller University, which is a kind of science university here in New York. And a very famous landscape architect named Ian McHarg gave a talk that night and about, the environment and about urban planning and so forth. But he was talking about the concept in landscape architecture called the reassuring landscape, which is that throughout one's life, one's always trying to recreate the reassuring landscape of one's youth. And that really struck a note with me. And I began to think about that. So that was sort of the beginning. And then when I married Fred Morgan, he had a house in Maine, and I was new to Maine. And for those of you in France, I have to tell you that all of these little small towns have tiny post offices, and usually they're run by women, postmistresses, and they're extremely powerful in these towns. And Mrs. Connery, our local postmistress, took me in hand because I knew nothing about Maine. And she told me that the next day, that the very famous garden called the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden, which was John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his wife Abby's garden on Seal Harbor, which is across the bay from where we lived, that they were having their open day. And I remember we went, my husband hadn't even heard of it yet, so we went the next day. And I remember standing there and saying that this is architecture. This is not just a garden. This is as intrinsic as a building, and the maintenance and the planning and I mean, it just absolutely, it was just an awakening for me. Now, I had studied abroad, I had been to Versailles, but as you know, you go to Versailles, you see small things, you can't see the all over plan together. So I've seen all these things, but something about the size and the context of it. It was designed by a woman named Beatrix Farron, who was Edith Wharton's niece. And so when I came to write about articles, and actually one of the first garden articles I did, actually the Rockefellers would not let me write about it. They didn't want the publicity, being an important family. They wanted to keep it very quiet. But within a year, there was a conference in Washington at a place called Dumbarton Oaks, which is where another one of her gardens still exists. And they had a conference on Beatrix Farron, and I got an assignment from the New York Times to write about it. And that was the beginning of my garden world. The garden world is a very generous world in New York. All of us garden writers are very friendly with one another. And it was that day, I think I met most of the friends that I still have today in that world. So it was like everything else. Once you start writing about a few gardens, editors began calling me. And so I just continued on and until I did my book of gardens. And about 3/4 of that book comes from articles in the New York Times, actually.
We still have so much to talk about, and we've hardly covered a lot of it. I want to jump really quickly to talk about your upcoming book because it's very relevant to our audience.
Right.
Talk about Thibaut IV and the Chansonnier.
Right. So many years ago, I'm not going to tell you how many because I've been working. I did the garden book even while I should have been writing this other book. But anyway, I've been treating the pandemic, everybody incidentally, like a sabbatical year.
Paula, I will say you've been having, more than anyone I know, the best time.
Yeah, well, you know, it's been such a tragic period. You don't want to advertise too much. That in some ways, and I'm sure other people agree with me, that we've all been given time. It's been an enormous opportunity to rethink our lives, really, amidst just a terrible tragedy. Yeah. But I was notified many years ago by a young editor who had been reading my articles in the New York Times, and he said that when I did my next book, he wanted to be my editor. And at that time, I had no idea. The garden book wasn't even in my mind. So when we met, I said, I haven't done a book yet. So why don't you give all those articles to your marketing people and they'll tell you what they want. And what they wanted, because they liked the travel pieces, they wanted a first-person narrative written abroad, a memoir about an experience abroad. And we kind of went back and forth for around 2 years. And finally, this young man said to me, don't worry, you'll wake up one morning and you'll have an idea and we'll all love it. And that's what happened. So I did my thesis at Columbia on Thibaut de Champagne, on his poetry, which were really songs. And I had remembered that, of course, he became, through his uncle, the King of Navarre as well. So he lived half the year in Provins, which is in Champagne, and half the year in Pamplona. And when he died at the age of 53, which is quite good at that time, he died in Navarre and was, buried in the cathedral. But his heart was allegedly sent back to this little town called Provins and buried in the chapel of the convent. And I literally woke up one morning, I remember it was just before Christmas, and I said to myself, I wonder if his heart is still there, or even more, if I made an itinerary of his entire life, including all the pilgrimage routes and he took a crusade and all the time in Navarre and so forth, would I still see what he saw? Would I still see the 13th century? And I have now done that for many years. I took my last trip, which I couldn't find a boat that would go across the Mediterranean because I had been to Israel and did the whole crusade, but I hadn't crossed it. And it was just in October 2019 that I found the ship that actually went from Monaco, not from Marseille, where he went to, but Monaco was the medieval kingdom itself. So I went from Monaco to Haifa, and then everything closed down, and I have been writing the book, and I'm on chapter 10 of 15, so I see my way through to maybe after around October that I'll have it all done. It'll be a great joy. And but it's been but it's a memoir. I mean, everybody says it's a biography, is it a history? It's not. Of course, you find out all about Thibaut, but it's really about my time. And of course, during this whole period, I arranged with a wonderful group in Paris called Alla Francesca that do concerts at the Cluny, and where they worked from his original manuscripts, and they did a fabulous concert both at the Cluny and here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And we also took the concert to Champagne and did it in Troyes. It was fantastic, having his 10 songs, sung to the people who live there now. So it's been a great adventure, and I hope to bring it to a close. Yes.
You'll bring it to a close, and then you'll come to the library, and we'll have another evening, an in-person evening to celebrate.
So, and hope to meet you all at that time.
Well, speaking of the audience, who I think are so kind of in awe of you that they're quiet this evening. If you haven't posted your question or comment for Paula, please go ahead and do so. We have about 15 minutes left of the event. If you've just joined us or you joined us late, you're at the American Library, albeit virtually. This is Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grower Annenberg, and I'm Alice McCrum, the Programs Manager, and I'm speaking to dear Paula Deitz about her long career at the Hudson Review and also her writing and journalism. So I have many questions, so I'll keep asking mine. I will say that somebody called Marie is in the audience, and she writes, I'm in Queens, New York, and owe a debt of gratitude to Paula for publishing me when I was just starting out as a poet. You have
That's Maria Tirone, right?
Exactly. And we have people from, Bill's from Dallas, Susan's in the Marais, lovely. Audrey is also in Paris, and Heather's tuning in from Napoli, Italy. So I just got a question from Crystal, and Crystal would like to know, Paula, how does the Hudson Review compare, for instance, to the Paris Review?
Well, I'll say right away, we don't give as many parties. We don't. They're great party people, and you know, I can't say that we're really different in any way. They do many more interviews than we do. People are always trying us with interviews. We've done a few, but I think that I would like to say that it just may be a matter of the opinions of the editors. And I mean, the only thing I will tell you, one time in our old office, I once came up in the elevator with Francis T.P. Plimpton, who was George Plimpton's father. And when he got off the elevator, he saw the Hudson Review on the door of my office, and he said, "Oh my goodness, you're my son's competition. May I come in?" You know, but we don't feel in competition. I think it's a matter of the point of view of editors, and so. And I haven't followed it very recently, I can tell you, because it just got a new editor, as you probably know, and probably whoever asked the question is thinking back, you know, on the George Plimpton days. But so I can't say more than I think we just may differ on what we accept.
We have Bruce Whiteman, who's tuning in from Canada, says it's so nice to meet you and thank you for this wonderful conversation.
He's one of my writers. See, we don't meet writers, we just email with them.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. Okay, I have a question from Hélène, who writes, did you and Mr. Morgan comment on each other's work differently than with the other writers? You were, after all, also a husband and wives. You still wanted to enjoy having breakfast together in the morning.
Is this commenting, say that again, commenting on our own writing or on other?
I imagine, let me read it again. Did you and Mr. Morgan comment on each other's work differently than with other, so as in, how did you negotiate kind of having work conversations and then kind of continuing?
Well, first let me tell you something. I had breakfast much earlier than Mr. Morgan. So it was mostly dinner time.
That's very funny. I had a conversation with someone yesterday who we were agreeing that having different schedules from a partner is actually fantastic.
Right. No, it's just I was an earlier riser, you know, in that way. But you know, I have to tell you honestly, I never remember arguing with him over something. Now, and also in my own writing, he didn't discuss it. He'd write comment. It was like a teacher. He would put comments right on the piece. And sometimes I would go back to him and say, what did you mean by that? Or, you know, can I improve that? Or would you read this again? But I just always felt it was so valuable to know anything that he had to think. And I think he felt that way about me as well, that there was tremendous value in what we had to say, that we weren't ever doing anything lightly. So we never came to blows. Heavens, no.
Can I ask you a fairly personal question, Paula?
What is that?
What
you're going to ask me a very personal. Okay, let's see.
Not too personal, but I wonder. You know, Fred was such a. I mean, he was your life partner. Seems. I mean, he was a partner in everything: husband, working partner, intellectual,
and friend.
and friend. So what was, I mean, how was it after he died, and how did you try and kind of fill that gap?
You know what I say if I don't get teary, but I lost Fred, but I did not lose the life that he and I created together. And I have not changed that life. So that it's not in a mysterious way. It's not like I think he's here. I don't believe in all those things. But it was clear when we got together that we created something together that neither of us had before, or that had no resemblance to anything we had before. So we set out and we created something entirely new together. And I've just continued that. And it's like a miracle that we did it. And I have no desire to give that up. So that in a way gave me comfort. Now also, I mean, this is a hard question to answer, as I'm sure you all know. And I'm not sure I can even say this without tearing. But the day before he died, I mean, he knew that he did not know he was dying. He was really, really not well at the end. But he said to me, "You'll grieve the rest of your life, but don't lose your vitality." And so I've taken that to heart, and that's how I live. That's how I that's how I did it. Yes. I have a lot of women who call me sometimes and ask me how to be a widow. And actually, I'm not going to name names, but I gave them Fred's message that he gave to me, "Don't lose vitality." And one of those women is now the provost of the whole of university. You understand? I mean, so life goes on.
Yeah.
Life is so precious. You can't waste it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you're always, you know, something that I so admire in you is you're always thinking forward and thinking about the future and thinking about you're so excited by what's to come. And you always say, well, we had talked on the phone and I had said, you know, what are some kind of standout issues? And you said, Alice, the best issue is always the issue that we've just published.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we just published, so
tell
you about our issues.
And the question is basically, we have some really exciting announcements about the future of the Hudson Review. And now I leave it to you to tell everyone what those developments are. Well,
first, over the years, we have to raise a lot of money. So we do apply for every application from the government, from the state. We have wonderful friends of the Hudson Review. We have over 100 people who actually donate to the Hudson Review, called the Friends of the Hudson Review. Anyone out there who wants to join, please do. I mean, I have to do that as well. But when we sometimes applied, let's say, to the National Endowment of the Arts, and you call up afterwards when we haven't gotten one, you get a little review of why. And something comes up all the time about our cover. Like, their cover is so, I don't know, conservative. I mean, it doesn't look like they're doing anything, because the cover is so quiet. And, I've always said, yes, but did they read anything? Did they look in the inside? Did they see all those young writers? I mean, so I finally one day I said, okay, we need a new cover. And I'm going to hire Chip Kidd, and people in France may not know it, but Chip Kidd is the #1 book designer in New York. There's no one like him. And I said, I'm going to put my whole life in his hands. Whatever he designs, I'm going to take it. And that's it. First, I'm going to show you what the Hudson Review looked like in the early days. This is it right in front of me. You see it? Okay. And then in recent years, we look like this. Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Very nice. We always have a colored band. This is the summer issue for summer. And then we'd have, let's say, green, for the fall. There we go. So Chip Kidd came in to see us. We had he asked wonderful questions about the history, how we all felt about it. He was there for hours talking to us. And then he went away. And 4 months later, he called me and said, I have the new cover. And my heart was really in my mouth. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to smile no matter what. And he walked in, and this is what he had.
Oh, and it's so useful.
A very elegant cover, keeping our color bands, which are going to be green, red, purple instead of brown for autumn and blue for winter. And then he put on this fabulous little medallion that you can all see, which is actually the facade of our, we still call it our newest office because we were at the last one for over 30 years. But we've been here, it's an absolutely gorgeous building on the west side. We are now in the what we call the Lincoln Center Arts District. We're right by the opera and the theater and dance. We're really thrilled to be in the Arts District of New York. And a marvelous landscape architect who's also done all the illustrations for my new book coming out, came and did a little sketch of the facade of our building. The west side has beautiful, beautiful architecture. We were delighted, and this became a very special issue. It's devoted to translation, and actually there is a Parisian author in it, Jacques Lederer. It's really a novella. It's very long, and it's written during the sort of Holocaust period when he was a young boy, Jewish boy in Paris in hiding. And I gather that it's somewhat autobiographical, marvelous translation by Sandra Smith. And then also Antonio Munoz Molina, who very famous Spanish author, has been in the Hudson Review many, many times, just received the Prix Medici last year for the best foreign novel. And actually that novel began in the Hudson Review because he and I had lunch one day. He was living in New York, getting ready to move back to Spain. And he said that before he went back, he loved walking in the city. And he had already done a piece for us on walking along the Hudson River where he was living. And he wanted to walk the entire length of Broadway. And for those of you who don't know, you just hear about Broadway and theater, but Broadway is the oldest street in New York. And it began where New York began, all the way down at the tip of the island where Wall Street is now. And it goes all the way up through Manhattan to the Bronx to a town called Yonkers. And he wanted to walk the entire strip over several days and write about it. And I said, fine, I will publish it. And it is so moving. I mean, it was marvelous. And he ends it with flying back and meeting his wife again in Madrid. And then kept writing and writing and writing, and it turned into a novel. And that came out, it just got, as I say, the Prix Medici. And in this issue, since he's living in Madrid, he's been sort of the artist in residence at the Prado and has been giving a series of lectures, and we published the first one about what it is to stand in front of paintings. It's a marvelous sort of humanist period kind of article about art. So it's, as I say, it's an adventure. And we're thrilled to have it.
Let's talk very briefly, because we have about 2 minutes before
yes.
the official end. Can you talk briefly about your foray into online subscriptions and also—
Oh, yes. All right, for everybody, beginning now, you may go online and get a digital subscription to the Hudson Review. If you already have a print one, you just write to the office and you'll be signed up. It's only $20 for a digital subscription. HudsonReview.com is our website. I love giving my ad, and we will be delighted to have. And if you're a subscriber, you can send us manuscripts at any time.
Thank you. And also just tell everyone really, again, briefly, your kids and teens program, because you always—
Oh, right. Okay. So many years ago, I was as an architecture critic, I was invited to go to Pakistan with a group organized by the Aga Khan for the opening in the Hunza Valley, which is up in the great mountains in the north part of Pakistan, for the opening of a 13th century fort called the Baltite Fort. And after the great big, hoopla and the big parties, he had a seminar for the architecture students about technical assistance in this town. And it was held in a girls' school. I love these girls. He had opened girls' schools all over the Hunza valleys, where the girls previously only harvested the crops. Of course, they had to get roads and get food from outside once the girls got education. But I loved the girls in this school, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to come back to this school and to do some teaching? And when I got home from that trip, there was an article in the New York Times about a girls' school called the Young Women's Leadership School that opened in Harlem, 10 blocks from where I live. And I called the principal and I said, I have an idea for a program. We'd love to come introduce your English classes to works in the Hudson Review that they read and study in class, and then we bring in the writer. And with that, 20 years ago, began a program called Writers in School. We're now in 8 schools. We are working with 700 students a year. And we continued virtually even during the pandemic because we just didn't have to pay transportation to our writers. They just were at home. We did it with the couple here in Paris, Richard Vivier and his wife, Larissa Volokonsky, the great Russian translators, because we've been publishing their stories by Pushkin. And they worked with 125 students one day in a Queen's school and back and forth, with Paris. So it's been a very successful and enjoyable program. It's really a magical program to see how the students feel when they meet a real writer and what it does to their own work.
I didn't realize it was your idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yes, and I have a wonderful, Eileen Talon is my assistant editor who does it with me. Actually one of your poet who asked the question, Maria Terrell from Queens, is one of the stars of the program. The students love hearing her read and talk about her poems. Yes.